Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Francois Chang. I'm the chairman and co-founder of the Cambridge University China Forum. We are a student-run society committed to fostering constructive discussions about China, and we aim to do this through organizing speaker events, presentations, discussion groups about various subjects relating to China and geopolitics, feminism, the environment, economics. And so without further ado, I'm happy and honored to introduce you to the first event of our term card with Professor Kerry Brown. Professor Brown is an alumni of Granville and Keyes College here in Cambridge and a distinguished fellow of Chatham House, an expert on Chinese politics and geopolitics. I'll now pass on the floor to Ike, a co-founder, who will lead the event, and I hope you enjoy those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. My name is Ike Chen. I'm the co-founder of this China Forum, and I'll be directing today's event. Thank you again for joining us at our inaugural event this afternoon. And we are delighted to have Professor Brown to talk about the ideal strategy for the UK with regards to China across diplomacy, trade, as well as corporations in international organizations. So my first question is, Professor Brown, how did you become interested in China, and what fueled your decades of work surrounding the country, first in diplomacy, then in academic research and public speaking?
Great. Well, look, thanks for inviting me today. It's good to be talking to students at the university where, in fact, I graduated in 1989. I was a graduate at Keyes College, and at that time, I indeed didn't study Chinese. I was English and philosophy. So my kind of development of interest in China, although it sort of started then a little bit, only really happened after I went to Asia and lived in Japan for a year and traveled to China in 1991. And then I developed a really, really strong interest in learning Chinese, which I did partly in Australia, where I was based for a few months, and then back in the UK. And since then, on and off, I've dealt with Asia or China. I worked in the Foreign Office for a few years. 3.5 of those years were in Beijing at the embassy there, and then 2 years was dealing with Indonesia, East Timor, and Philippines. And then kind of another year or so was dealing with visa policy. Then I was the head of the Chatham House Asia program. And then I went to Australia and was the professor of Chinese politics and the director of the China Studies Centre there. And since 2015, I've been back in London at King's College. So, I mean, it's accidental that I've become, so closely involved with China. I guess that is partly through intellectual interest, partly through opportunity, and partly through having had the opportunity to go and live there for nearly 6 years in 2 different periods, and to have visited over 100 times. I think it's hard to calculate, but many, many times. And so that has given me a sort of lived experience of different aspects of contemporary China and many different friendships in the country with different kinds of people. So to me, I found it, immensely rewarding in terms of culturally, intellectually. It's been a wonderful experience. So I've been very, very positive.
Right. Yeah, thank you for sharing this experience. China has been quite a popular topic at Cambridge right now. And I'm just wondering, was this the same case during your time at uni? And because at the time, I would imagine the joint declaration was still in its drafting stage. And was China popular back then, or was it just not the centerpiece of the political discourse?
No, I mean, I think my college, Keyes, was the college of Joseph Needham, Li Haise, the very, well-known historian of Chinese science and civilization. And indeed, I do remember him as a very old man. I think I only spoke to him once or twice. But, he died in 1995, actually at the age of 95, and he produced this enormous history. And, so I think I was aware that there was one aspect of China which was very, very unknown, and that was about its complex histories and what had happened before the modern period. But also it wasn't easy to get access to the country. Tourism there or traveling there was very, very, it was happening, but not huge numbers. And also, as you say, I mean, because of Hong Kong, the political relationship wasn't easy, but it wasn't, I think it was more of a marginal issue. Many people just didn't follow the issue and, weren't really that engaged with it. I guess in 1989, although I don't remember very well, in June 89, because of Liu Si, because of Tiananmen Square, there was a big kind of interest in China at that time because of the collapse of communism in Soviet Union and all these kind of things. And it really belonged to that story, basically, a political story. At my college, and I think at Cambridge elsewhere at that time, there wasn't a lot of, there weren't Chinese students, very, very few. In fact, I think I can't remember coming across a single one. And there weren't many scholars from China that I was aware of. There weren't many kind of opportunities really to engage with China. I mean, Oriental studies at Cambridge, as it was very specialist. I think there were one or two people studying it in my college. And, this was regarded as being a very hard area, and people that did it, it was really kind of unusual, and not a lot of kind of wider appreciation of the kind of why should we be interested in Chinese culture. So I think at that time, it wasn't like there were many opportunities to really try and engage and understand what was happening in China and what kind of things China could be in your own environment.
Right. I mean, in the past decade, we definitely saw tremendous growth in terms of Chinese students and scholars at Cambridge. But right now, there is a decoupling in the space of higher education started in the United States, where PhD students are prohibited from entering some sensitive subjects. And this has transformed or in the United Kingdom as well, with recent announcement that certain subjects may block postgraduate Chinese students from entering. I'm just wondering, what do you think the possible effects of this proposal if implemented?
When you say blocked, do you mean blocked by the UK or blocked by China, or by both?
By the UK.
Ah, okay. Well, it's unfortunate. I mean, I guess as societies that say, that live on open values and believe in transparency, it is a pity if we are starting to ask that students don't do particular subjects, and we need to have a pretty strong reason for why. I mean, it seems a strange thing to bring in a blanket ban. I guess, nothing was really planned about the really big increases in Chinese students that came to Britain or to America and elsewhere. I mean, it's a phenomenon that has sort of grown of its own sort of accord. And it's a decision, not because of governments, but because of individual families. And I know that with my own sort of, students and colleagues from China. I mean, they've all made their own decisions why they want to come, and they've gone about it in different ways. So I think there's not an appreciation of, the fact that this is not a state-directed process, although the Chinese state is opportunistic, and I'm sure, does take a close interest in, what Chinese students might be doing here. But, there's very many of them. I can't see that it would be easy to keep, an eye on everyone. I mean, it wouldn't be easy to keep an eye probably even on a kind of relatively, small number. So I think it's probably, the American case is different, and there's much more kind of intensity. The UK is probably in some ways duplicating that. The UK is in a difficult position because it's between, the Uncle Sam and the sort of, the great panda, it's between these two, not an easy place to be.
Right.
And so it's kind of trying to balance things. I hope that the current period is, an anomaly, but, maybe it's going to set in more sort of long term. We have to do what we can to make sure, though, that there's as much contact as possible between the UK and China.
Yeah, of course. Bring back to contemporary politics. Boris Johnson is a self-described Sinophile, and but the British government has since banned Huawei, sanctioned CGTV, a Chinese state-run broadcast media, and had a very tough stance on issues surrounding Hong Kong. So just follow upon what you just discussed. Do you think there's still freedom for the UK to devise a relatively independent and coherent strategy, or has America's position has taken that flexibility away?
Well, I mean, on the Hong Kong issue, because the UK had a direct interest, it had a individual kind of approach. Whether the UK towards China has had much real freedom is, another question. I mean, a lot of policy was run via Brussels when we were part of the European Union, and now it seems a lot of policy is run via Washington. So when was the time when Britain really had a foreign policy towards China? It's a big question to me. I really wonder. We've attempted to change the attitude towards China with the Golden Age, and then with recent events, we've gone, however, from one extreme to the other. So I think it's going to be very, very tough for us to be able to articulate a strong, convincing narrative towards China. And the current government are so distracted by Brexit and by COVID-19 that I think it's not likely that there will be a very coherent approach to China to emerge anytime soon. All that we see is how the tough words used towards China, without a sense of what those actually mean in practice. Are we going to basically not work with China in many significant areas, or are we going to put conditions in? How are we going to basically implement this policy? I mean, it's easy to talk hard, but for this government in the position they're in, it's not going to be easy to act hard on some things, and we won't know the answer to that until, I guess, next year when the economic fallout of COVID-19 is clearer.
You brought an interesting point that sometimes politicians here in the UK talk a bit tough towards China, but it doesn't have any sort of serious consequence as an implication. And you have previously said in interviews that human rights is not a fruitful area to have a dialogue with China, given it is perceived as a political show and with no real consequences. So do you think that the whole topic should be directly dropped from official channels and be handled by civil organizations entirely?
Well, I mean, all I can see at the moment is that we've been trying to talk together about, human rights issues for 30 years and don't seem to have got very far. The Chinese government, it's not interested, and it doesn't, at the moment, seem to be particularly sort of feel that it's got anything to learn from Europe and America in terms of, delivering governance and things. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I mean, but that's just the way it's behaving. And because of the very big divisions in our societies at the moment, they might disappear, they might not, but it's very hard for us to say we're a model for what society should be. There's inequalities, divisions, and this is really a tough point from which to speak. The best point to speak from is when you show through your values that you're, having better lives. And well, it's more complicated at the moment. It's not easy to really show that. I also think that, to be honest, some of the most harsh criticisms of China are directed by political agendas, by particular groups and individuals in Europe and America and Australia. They have their own reasons for wanting China to be the kind of negative entity they think it is. And so a lot of their criticisms are predetermined by their own political bias, to be honest. I mean, that seems to me one of the unfortunate things, that there are really important things to take issue with China on at the moment, but they're not being expressed well by a lot of groups that should express them because of this political kind of, sort of agenda that they have, particularly in America, where you've got strong, kind of desire to see China as the enemy no matter what. And because of it being a communist country, most people have no real idea what that means. So it's very politicized. So on human rights, I mean, it's always a battlefield. At the moment, it's impossible, I think, to really talk. We can talk about human values and understand better about what the Chinese proposition on human values is. And we can try and just work out where we align and where we don't align. I mean, there are obviously areas where the Chinese government is doing things that are improving the lives of people, and there are other areas where it isn't. And we have to work out what our approach to that is. And rather than just declaring that this is a problem and making, kind of big declarations about it, I think we need to then think, well, what do we actually do, or is there nothing we can do? I think a lot we can do comes from our own behavior. And if we don't live up to our values, then it's not surprising that it's, kind of more and more difficult to promote those then with parties that have a different view and who might change their mind, but are not likely to when they're dealing with people who don't seem to do the same thing as they say that they're meant to be doing.
Right. You mentioned that there is a group of politicians from the States, mostly from the right, that took a more reductive approach towards China instead of understanding the complexities and nuances towards the problem. But it has occurred that the whole China problem has become more universal across Democrats and Republicans, with many people from the left agreeing on the platform, positioning China as a sort of strategic opponent. With the upcoming election, do you think, assuming if Joe Biden wins, would you expect a certain change in policies from the States towards China? Or would the Biden administration sort of carry on what the legacies of Donald Trump?
No, I mean, I think this is structurally going to stay there. The China-US competition is not going to go away. And as China's economy is likely to become more bigger and maybe even be the world's biggest economy in the next decade, this is going to be more and more of a big issue, because it's just never been planned that the world's biggest economy would be a communist country. I mean, it's very hard for people to kind of work out what that means. So whoever's elected, if it's Trump or if it's Biden, I don't think it makes a difference to that challenge remain there. I don't think Chinese leaders want to see an America, as weak and divided as it is. I mean, I don't think anyone wants to see that. And so I think, although they might want Donald Trump to be re-elected because it's likely he's going to carry on creating divisions and the country's going to carry on becoming less and less engaged in its international issues. But I think for the Chinese leadership, this is we get sort of unpredictability. And so they probably would prefer a more coherent approach. And the Trump approach has not been coherent. It's been driven by a number of key things like the trade imbalance, and it's been amoral. I mean, Trump has not really got a big interest in democracy in Hong Kong. He's not. I mean, he sort of reportedly said things about Xinjiang to Xi Jinping that most of the very right-wing groups would think appalling, so Trump has sort of managed to kind of create the right rhetoric towards China that attracts the more hardline, kind of opponents of China in America. In terms of action, it's been pretty incoherent. Bits and pieces in a trade deal, but the big issues largely left alone. And I guess that's unlikely to change because, to be honest, every day it seems, economically at least, China gets stronger and America gets weaker.
Cool. You served as the first secretary at British Embassy in Beijing, I believe towards the end of the 90s and the beginning of early 2000s. At the time, China was entering, the World Trade Organization, and was it a surprise that it grew so fast towards to become the entity it is today, or was it anticipated the time the country joined the organization?
No, I mean, I was serving at the British Embassy in Beijing in 2001 at the time that, China joined the WTO. And I think most analysis was that it would be pretty challenging, that China would not be able to fulfill the requirements that it had set so easily, that its agricultural sector would be exposed to foreign competition, that its state enterprises would be exposed to multinationals. So I think the assumption at the time was that it was going to be a pretty hard thing, that China would probably be able to do it, but it wouldn't be economically very straightforward. And of course, we really were wrong. I mean, the WTO unleashed forces of productivity in China that no one knew were there, really. And I think between 2001 and 2012, under Hu Jintao, China's economy quadrupled in size. I mean, there was never a growth like this for such a huge economy in the history of the world. I mean, forget, it's now all about Xi Jinping, but I mean, Hu Jintao was the master of growth, right? I mean, he may not have done many other things, but I tell you, China under him, the earth grew gold. In Inner Mongolia, in Huahhalta, I think the growth rate in the mid part of that decade, 2007, 2008, was 36%, something incredible. I mean, you couldn't, you could literally pick gold off the street. So I think Hu Jintao is not credited with many things now. It's talked about China's lost decade. I think actually it's not a lost decade because it's the foundation. Without that wealth creation, China would not be able to be in the position it is now.
Right. I think Hu Jintao is viewed more as a moderate or transitional figure, but in actuality, he brought a lot of economic liberalization to the country, a massive growth, and a rise of middle class, which has been tremendous in engineering, what the Chinese society it is today. But
Yeah.
at the time, would you expect that economic liberalization will bring some sort of change in the political structure? Was this a common consensus at the time?
No, I mean, I think in the late 1990s, because not a lot was known about Hu Jintao, there was always speculation that he was, a liberal. But I mean, there's no evidence that he was a liberal. I mean, and I don't know what a liberal really means. I mean, at the time, maybe Chao Shi in the late 1990s, who was a Politburo member, maybe would have been into sort of political reforms, possibly. But I mean, only in a very limited sense. I think the difference is that some felt in order to maintain power, the Communist Party needed to, make some changes. And that was what happened under Jiang Zemin with the Sangha Daibiao. The idea you had to bring in particular forces into the party and, the non-party members need to be enfranchised.
Right.
But I think it's liberalism with Chinese characteristics is not the same as liberalism in the sense that, in Isaiah Berlin or a philosopher like that. I mean, it's just not the same kind of context. And I think that no leader in China is likely to be a liberal. I mean, Hu Jintao in his time in Tibet, in his time in Gansu, in early part of his career, gave no indication that he was interested in anything except being a faithful servant of the party and maintaining its monopoly on power. And that's the same as Xi Jinping. So I don't think that they contemplate doing any kind of reforms which are not linked to making one party rule sustainable. No
Right.
change. It's their main objective.
But in terms of the power dynamics between, say, the chairman and the central committee, do you think she has broke the equilibrium in terms of the individual leader as well as the overseeing senior members of CCP? Or do you think it's more like a static equal thing in the past decade?
I don't think, no, I mean, I think it's never been static. I think every single leadership in China has been very particular. I mean, Mao Zedong, very particular leader, right? I mean, no restraints on the limits to his power at all. Although it went through challenging periods. Deng Xiaoping, again, didn't have formal positions but had power. He was never the party secretary. Well, not in the 1980s. He was never the sort of general secretary. He was never president. He had no formal position apart from vice premier and head of the military. Jiang Zemin had lots of positions, probably did have power, but again, he had a very powerful premier in Zhurongji from 1997, 1998. So, Hu Jintao had Wen Jiabao. They were kind of quite closely linked. They'd worked in Gansu in the 1970s. So they probably had links that maybe people don't know about that made them very close to each other. But, you know, Xi Jinping's relationship with Li Keqiang is not well understood. But then all of these relationships between the, you know, the general secretary and the president and the premier, they've all been different. The problem is that there's no model. I mean, people say there is a model, but there isn't a model. They've all been very, very different. So I think to talk about, you know, the fact that this is different to before, well, but every time it's been different to before. So, you know, it depends on the kind of power dynamics with a particular leadership and, you know, the tasks that they're kind of faced with, not just on the personality and the desire of the party led, you know, the party boss.
Right. Go back to the British strategy towards China. I'd like to quote Cultural Secretary Oliver Dowden, which said the Downing Street is aiming for a modern and a mature relationship with China, where we are able to speak frankly when we disagree, but also work side by side with China on issues where our interests converge. With Xi's administration being very assertive and less flexible in dealing with international affairs, do you think that this is still a good foundation in approaching China, where we disagree, we speak frankly when we disagree?
Well, I mean, I think that maybe British politicians need to get on a plane and go to China and understand what they're looking at, because what country likes other countries to come and you know, start telling it where it's making problems and what's wrong with it? I mean, you know, the UK left the European Union because of complaints about Brussels telling Britain what to do. So I don't know why British politicians seem to think that it's okay for, you know, London to start telling Beijing what to do when Britain is a much smaller economy and geopolitically much less powerful than China now. I mean, I think you've got to invest time and effort into a relationship with such an important country. In some ways, Britain has done that, and the current group of leaders in the cabinet, none of them, not even Johnson, has much exposure or much knowledge of China. I mean, none of them. George Osborne before was not widely liked, but at least he had spent, you know, he'd gone there as a student on a holiday, and he had a bit of an, you know, interest in the place. I mean, he did have an interest in the place. So I think what I find interesting is that with no, I mean, this is a government with an attitude towards China, but not much knowledge.
Right.
You know, you obviously, yeah.
So you think the current foreign policy establishment has sort of lagged behind the geopolitical changes, as well as just not being well informed in terms of what China is like in terms of politics and culture? Do you think that diplomats in British embassy in Beijing should have a greater voice in terms of advising the foreign secretary and the foreign office to develop a coherent and practical policy instead of just speaking empty rhetorics?
I mean, I think it's always been the case that, you know, there's been an excellent group of officials in the Foreign Office, maybe elsewhere in government too, you know, who do need to understand and look at China and have a deeper kind of, you know, sort of link with China. And yeah, I mean, for once, you know, for a brief period, I was, you know, involved in that, and I do understand that for them, you know, they're dealing with politicians who have lots of other priorities. But I think what is difficult now is that this government has a very tense relationship with its bureaucrats. You know, it's wanting a wenhua with its bureaucrats, right? I mean, it wants a sort of big fight with its bureaucrats, right? So that's one issue. I think the second issue is that this is a very parochial leadership. They're not particularly, doesn't seem to me that they have a, you know, sort of global view, even though they say it's for global Britain. They are very focused on issues within Britain. And as I say, in all of the you know, the cabinet and even beyond, the politicians, there's not many that have really thought hard about what we do with this country, which we fundamentally don't agree with on some things, but which we can't ignore. You
Right.
know, I mean, it seems to me very simple. If you fundamentally agree with someone, sorry, if you fundamentally disagree with someone, you must work out what you do about that.
Mhm.
You either live with that, or you say, look, on this thing we can't work with each other. On that, you know, we work with each other, or you don't work with them.
Right.
And the way that some of the current government and their MPs talk about China, the way they talk about China in order to, I presume, you know, get the support of groups in the UK is very strong, very categorical, very strong. And it seems to imply, therefore, that they want to completely walk away from China. And you know, we can do that for sure. It'll be a very, very hard thing. We could do it. But I mean, they say no, they don't want to do that.
Right.
So it's a bit like you're sort of stuck with, you know, a kind of partner who, on the one hand, yells at you and says, you know, good, but then won't go. So I
Right.
think this is not a very harmonious outcome.
Yeah. You just mentioned George Osborne. The golden era with China during the Cameron-Clark coalition. Do you think there are lessons or shortcomings from this fleeting period of cooperation where UK essentially opened massive investment opportunities to China, which include constructions of nuclear power plants?
Well, the lesson is be careful what language you use. You know, don't use language which overpromises, but certainly don't use language, which I think is the case now, which is very, very strong in condemning China and very strong in saying China is, you know, a massive problem, but then doesn't seem to kind of want to actually say, well, okay, we, you know, we have very, very clear lines where we're not going to be able to work with China, and sometimes those lines will be damaging to our interests.
Right.
You know, I mean, economically, the problem is that economically the UK is now in a crisis, I think,
Mhm.
and that crisis may get worse. And well, you cannot deal with the world's fifth, you know, a world's second biggest economy and fifth, you know, a fifth of humanity and a fifth of the global GDP. You don't have to deal with that, but the costs go up. If you don't deal with it, the costs go up. So,
Right.
you know, the politicians have to explain to people who may not have jobs, who may not have livelihoods, why they cannot do more with the world's second biggest economy, because they feel there are more important things that don't, you know, look after people's livelihood.
Interesting. Um, Following upon that, the Tory government has promised a free trading global Britain in the post-Brexit era. There's another piece of analysis by the Financial Times which suggested that the UK-China trade has a trade deficit. So, how big do you think China will be in this picture um, of British economy post-Brexit, given that we have also been strengthening our ties with traditional trans-Pacific partners like Japan and Australia?
Well, at the moment, China is not a huge trading partner. I mean, it's a significant one, but not a huge one. And it's not a massive investor. So, as the second biggest economy, it presumably could do much more.
Mhm.
And, you know, that's one of the areas where the UK maybe would be able to develop more in terms of services, because at the moment that's not been an area that the UK has done as much as it wanted, but it's a strength of our economy. I mean, the areas of investment, trade, and finance and intellectual, you know, kind of partnership are the ones that have been the strongest and the most, you know, kind of potential. But if you've got a political environment which means that you can't really develop those to their full, then, you know, you have a problem. I mean, the world's second biggest economy is going to remain inaccessible unless you don't get your political approach right.
Mm.
And I don't think that we have cracked that one at the moment. It's not an easy one to crack. I understand it's not an easy one to crack, but I don't think that we have got to a place where we can balance our differences with the things that we need from China and get the right language.
Right. I was actually, I visited the British Embassy in Beijing last summer, talked with a few staff there. Um,
Mm.
I'm just wondering, what do you think, with the Chinese economy slowing down inevitably, would this have any effect on its cooperation with the UK, or is everything just static and we should move on with what we have accomplished previously?
Well, as I said, we didn't accomplish a lot previously, so I think we couldn't really stay in that position. The Chinese economy slowing down may also be an opportunity, because I think the Chinese government wants to, restart growth, and its partnerships with maybe British or American companies is one way of doing that. There's been indications that finance companies like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are finding more to do in China now than, before the sort of slowdown. So I think there are opportunities that come from this, and a China that is in more need may well be a China that's easy to deal with economically for the UK. But as I say, I mean, that's not easy to do when the language towards China is often, quite strong. I mean, I understand the language from China to the UK is also strong, but we two wrongs don't make a right. So I think we have to recognize there are things that we could do better with China, and we have to find the right approach and the right way of talking about that. And we also have to have public support for it.
Right. So you mentioned the major part of the flaw of our current policy is that we are not speaking in the appropriate language, and we are not establishing a friendly environment to facilitate a meaningful cooperation. So how do you have any sort of suggestions on tangible policies or things we can implement besides the soft, cultural and environmental side of the political discourse?
Well, I mean, I think you can use the language you want as long as it's backed up by knowledge. And as you know, from being originally from China, Chinese officials, if you've got your facts right, you have to be very specific. If you want to sort of have an argument, you have to really get your facts right and choose what you're talking about and have good knowledge. And I think that's really important. So the practical thing, it's a very small thing for me. The practical thing is that the UK has to invest more in broader education about China and Asia, but about China, because this region, not just China, but the Asian region is increasingly becoming the engine of global growth.
Right.
And, I think we are at the moment poorly equipped in terms of our worldview and education. Historically, we did have an elite that dealt with this area, but these days it's still an elite, and it shouldn't be. There should be broad understanding that why China matters in our daily lives. I mean, I think there's a basis there. I think there's lots of people who probably have engaged with China and do have different knowledge levels about it. The government needs to, do a better job of leadership of that. At the moment, it's overwhelmed by what it's dealing with in Britain, but, it has to kind of look. I mean, if you're going to have big fights with China at the moment, you're going to have to fight on many battlefronts. I think you've got to really prioritize. Some of those will be difficult choices, but I think you can't, at the same time as you're fighting an economic crisis and a public health crisis, also, have a Cold War with a fifth of humanity. It's not, it's not easy. So I think we've got to be very, very, kind of aware of where we prioritize things.
Yeah, certainly. We have just gathered a few questions from our live audience, and I have selected quite a few. So the first question is, there are lots of criticisms about China being a negative influence internationally, namely like accusations of neo-colonialism in Africa and Central Asia, as well as like the general Belt and Road initiatives. Is this accusation justified, and are there other complexities of looking into this problem?
Well, I don't think that China is a neo-colonialist. I mean, I think it's sort of an opportunist, but I don't think it's in the business of creating colonies. I mean, unless you really want to stretch the definition of colony to something that I think is way beyond what it historically has been. For sure, I mean, China's opportunities now are very big, and so in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, it is a significant player. some of those places it's real and actual, and some of those it's yet to happen. But I think for China, the Belt and Road is as much a risk as it is an opportunity. I mean, it's going to overstretch. It's dealing with a lot of places it's never really dealt with before, and it's doing it as a sort of very alien force in a way. I mean, Chinese values, Chinese culture, Chinese approach to dealing with the outside world are relatively new and little understood things. So despite the fact that there is a kind of increasing narrative in the heads of critics of these things in, Europe and America, that the Belt and Road is some hegemonistic, kind of colonial gambit by China, I don't think it's as neat as that. I mean, if it was neat as that, we'd be able to combat it a bit easier. What it is much more kind of liquid and dependent on the places where China is and who it's just acting with. I mean, that's the nature of Chinese power. It's very spectral and amorphous, and that gives it, I mean, a certain resilience, but it also makes it, I guess, vulnerable to accusations because it's hard to know what it is or isn't in the first place.
Right. The second question, very interesting question. So it says there are many Chinese students in UK and US universities, which come from an elite background in terms of politics. Lots of high officials in China send their sons and daughters to top universities abroad. Do you think that in the future there will be a growing liberalism as a result of this, sending your children to universities in the West, or do you think this wave will be maybe swamped by
with the greatest respect? I think that you can ask some of your colleagues at the elite university where you are at the moment the answer to this question. I mean, all I can say is there's no evidence so far.
Right.
I mean, and I mean, just because someone has studied somewhere means very little about what they're going to be like when they go back to their home country and have positions of power. Right. Bashir, in Syria was, a doctor in London for a number of years. And, well, he's very liberal. I think we shouldn't assume that, if we thought that Chinese students came to Britain in order to be indoctrinated, I don't think it's worked, and I don't think it would ever work, and I don't think it's what we should be doing in any case. People all decide things for very different reasons, and I think there'll be some students that go back to China maybe and maybe are more interested in political reform, and some that will probably be more interested in the complete opposite.
Right. Okay, the third question asks, what are your views on, I'm not sure if you heard of this guy, Ren Zhiqiang, media mogul, which was recently sentenced to jail after issuing some criticisms.
Yeah, Ren Zhiqiang was actually a member of the elite. Yeah, I mean, his family were also a member of the sort of, the kind of elite political families, and so I mean, he was able to get away with fairly critical things for a number of years. I suppose the kind of criticisms of Xi Jinping that he issued this year were very strong. I mean, saying that Xi Jinping wasn't up to the job and very personal. So it was a brave thing to do. And the 18-year kind of sentence he got was very harsh. I mean, you think Liu Xiaobo, who was a sort of, kind of long-term activist, in 2008, 2009, got, I think, 11 years for Charter 08. He was one of the co-authors of parts of that. So 18 years is really harsh. And I think Ren Zhiqiang is actually in his 70s, maybe late 60s, early 70s. So it's almost like a death sentence. And well, I mean, what can you say? I mean, it's a sign of how little space there is to express alternative political views in China at the moment. Maybe this is because of the crisis, the COVID crisis. Maybe it's because of this need to keep politics very tight and controlled until, China is a great, powerful, sort of strong country. The whole Xi Jinping leadership has been about delivering these nationalist goals. And, no one can dissent from those because they're regarded as fundamental for China's long-term security and stability. So I think if, I was sitting here with Xi Jinping now and said, why did you, 你对那个人选手那么厉害的? I think he would probably say, 应该的. I guess he would say, look, we have these big goals and nothing can distract from them. I know it's very harsh and the outside world goes crazy at us, but to be honest, the stakes are high. If we get this wrong, our dream for 100 years or so is going to go. We can't take any risks with this. Well, I mean, it's not an argument that, it's not an argument that, you may disagree with that argument, but you can't deny that it is an argument, right? So I look upon these issues in that context, and although they're really unfortunate, I guess the Communist Party of China's mindset is a risk management entity, and it sees these things as risks, not any other way. It just sees them as risks, and it deals with them. You don't tolerate risk, you just suppress it.
Right.
That's, I think, the way they think.
Interesting. Another question. Do you fear conflict given China has been expanding territorially in Tibet, South China Sea, as well as India, some recent advancement to Taiwan as well? Do you think there might be a possibility of a local
about Tibet and the inland regions, the mainland, kind of territorial regions? I think, the border clashes with India are worrying, and I think a fight, maybe on a limited scale, with India is very possible. And that's worrying because they're two nuclear powers, and they're both very ambitious. They're both similar numbers of people now. And they both have strong regional ambitions, so not good. I mean, India and China had a war in 1961, and they have a reason to have a war, the contested border, so very big problem. And I think the other big problem, Taiwan, has become particularly bad because of this fear in Beijing of two things. One is American involvement, America using Taiwan as a means of, really kind of attacking China. But also because I think for Taiwanese, the view they have of the one country, two systems in Hong Kong means that I don't think there's public support for reunification. I think the public support for reunification has largely gone, but I think that, the one country, two systems is completely unacceptable if it means what's happened in Hong Kong. So for Taiwanese, their sense of identity is strong. And I guess for the Beijing government to try and deal with that means that you either have to, so they've tried the soft route, which is economic and cultural links, and, like under Ma Ying-jeou, and that has led to Tsai Ing-wen and a sort of stronger pushback. And I think the temptation is that they will now think of the harder approach. And so I think the possibility of conflict in this region is, it's still not likely, but it's becoming more likely. So that's really, really unfortunate. And I guess the only thing about Taiwan is for the world to say that any aggressive move against Taiwan would be an absolute catastrophe for China's global image. And it would create a dual-track world. So, that would be an enormous price to pay.
Right. You just mentioned China is run as a sort of risk management type of enterprise. Do you think with its advances on Hong Kong, it's rather risk-seeking instead of risk-averse? And would you consider this as an inconsistency with its policies in terms of risk management?
I think that the Taiwan issue is different to other issues because it does arouse emotions. And I think it is an historic vision, for Xi Jinping to resolve this issue would mean he would go down in history as the great leader who did what not even Mao Zedong was able to do. So I think it would be appealing to his sense of historic mission. Now, that might be just a soft kind of framework for, kind of links between the two. As I say, in Taiwan, there's no attitude, there's no appetite for that at all. I mean, at most, there's support for status quo. And I think the problem is that for young Taiwanese, they have no real links with China at all. I mean, their links are elsewhere, or their links within Taiwan. They're Taiwanese. Their identity is Taiwanese. So if you have an aggressive move, then you kind of have to deal with 24 million people who do not want what is happening. That's kind of just a huge. It's very, 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 very hard to see that working. So I think on this issue, the only thing that China might cause it to misstep is that it thinks very emotionally about this issue. It doesn't think rationally, and the nationalistic sort of nature of the Xi leadership might make it do things normally a very rational actor it wouldn't do. So everywhere else, I think China is guided by self-interest. With Taiwan, actually, it's the place where it's least guided by self-interest and most by rational emotion. And the problem is that there are plenty in America who would want to exploit that, because they would think they are crazy enough to think that this is the way to go for China. If they move on Taiwan, then there's the excuse to move on China, and then you get an escalation. Right. That would be a disaster. That would be an absolute disaster for the region and the world.
Certainly. Caroline Wilson just took office as the ambassador to China. What are the biggest challenges, you think, to her? And do you have any tips from your diplomatic career?
Caroline is a former colleague, and I would not dare to presume to give her tips. She is an extremely distinguished and experienced diplomat who has done many different jobs at a much, much, much higher level than I ever dare to. So I wouldn't presume to give her advice. I guess what I suspect will be her biggest problem is not, she's got lots of experience of dealing with China and as previously working in Hong Kong. I expect her biggest problem will probably be dealing with politicians back in Britain. Because they're all going to want different things, and she's already been criticized for meeting Liu Xiaoming, the Chinese ambassador, and getting a copy of Xi Jinping's third volume of his talks. And so this in the past this would be nothing. This is just a bit of diplomatic theater. But now, of course, everything that you do is exposed to a high level of scrutiny, and I suspect her biggest problem is going to be trying to deal with politicians back here.
Certainly. In the context of COVID, what do you think are the impacts of vaccine diplomacy?
The impacts in terms of if suddenly someone in China makes a vaccine, obviously is going to mean that suddenly we're all going to have to be very, very friendly towards China to get to get our hands on it. If China creates a vaccine with other partners, that's a good symbol, because it shows that in these areas, China and the world needs to work together. If the outside world gets the vaccine before China, it means that there is a certain leverage and power that it will have. So it's a deeply political issue. It's a deeply, deeply political issue. The outcome would be a joint effort that creates a vaccine. And maybe that's the likeliest one, because, to be honest, I think Oxford and other places in China are working together, and with that combination, it shows that there are places where we can do, and in fact now are doing more work than ever before.
Right. In terms of climate change, one of the interests where it converges, China recently announced that it will go carbon neutral by 2060. Do you think that it is leading it's a leader in the world in terms of addressing climate change? And do you think there will be some substantial implications of this announcement?
Well, it's certainly a leader in terms of the language it uses. So I think it certainly kind of produces the right sort of gestures and the right kind of language. In terms of its actions, that's not so easy. So I think, we have to kind of be aware of not only what it says, but what it does. So I think, though it's very welcome and very important that China makes the declaration that it did at UN, about being carbon neutral by 2060. It really does need to do things about that, and it needs to have the support and cooperation of the world around it. And so a leadership role here is actually very important, because it's one of the areas where China at least is speaking a common language to the rest of the world.
Right. Okay, final question here. One of our audience asked, what are you currently working on after publishing
Right.
so many books in the past?
So at the moment, I'm collecting a sort of group of excerpts of important Western or non-Chinese figures through the last 800 years of their encounters or their thinking about China. So people like the early travelers to China, Marco Polo and Carpini, and then people from the Jesuit period in the 17th century, 16th century, Matteo Ricci, and then people like Voltaire, Leibniz, and Montesquieu, kind of looking at them, and then right up to sort of 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Roland Barthes, and all these people who wrote about China. So I'm looking at intellectual engagement with China from predominantly America and the United States, as America and Europe.
Okay, so essentially looking at how, like, the evolution of Western perspective from intellectuals in the past 800.
Well, evolution is a grand term. I mean, to me, it seems no change. I mean, there's always been this desire to have China become like us, or people like Leibniz, who accepted China on its own terms and tried to understand it. So Voltaire, a very positive view of China, Montesquieu, a very, very negative view of China, and Leibniz, I think, a very empirical view. And that's 300 years ago. That is exactly the same as the debates we have now. No change.
Definitely looking forward to the book when it gets published.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, look, thank you for inviting me today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for attending the event today, joining us at our inaugural talk. Next Tuesday, we'll be talking about the Belt and Road Initiative with Jonathan Hillman. So stay tuned and have a great week. Bye.